We all have a paper here. This is a short, relatively brief summary, as it were, of the considerable data that we've collected from students. If you don't, then you can collect one from the front here. We've got extra copies. There's a much longer paper as well, which we've put up on the web, and I'll give the URL for that later in the presentation. Okay. We've called this a virtual learning environment because that's indeed what it is. It is a VLE. So it's not just a webcast in itself. We're trying to build in resources into and around the webcast. And we do regard this as a virtual learning environment. We kind of put up a very kind of general definition of it there. There are examples of VLEs which are probably better called MLEs, managed learning environments, because they focus, such as Blackboard and WebCT, because they focus much more on issues such as registration, authentication, administration and so on. Our environment deals not at all with those things, so there is no administration of learning taking part there in our environment. That what we do have is a focus on learning and teaching rather than the administration of that. But when we're thinking about webcasts, and particularly if we're not thinking about the administration of learning, we've found that again and again it's involved us in redesign of traditional forms of teaching and learning. In other words, and Patricia will certainly be showing this later on, it's not sufficient just to take what you traditionally did and think that it will work as well as it used to do in the traditional environment in this new electronic environment. For example, the communicative potential of the environment, that really lies at the heart of everything that we do there. It's not just a kind of put up some kind of image, as it were, of a talking head and let students look at that instead of a real-life person in a lecture. What we're trying to do, really, is look at how that can be put into some kind of a resource environment. One of the principles that we found really useful here was the convergence of electronic technologies and also the convergence of all technologies, and that includes a book, because we, of course, regard books and all forms of text as technologies, which indeed they are. And that means that basically we really have to look at being much more creative in our use of the traditional forms of teaching and learning, and that includes seminars. What you're going to be seeing are not distance learning courses. They are webcasts that are used as kind of embedded units within face-to-face teaching. If we're thinking then about webcasts as kind of embedded units within a course, we've got to think about using integrated text and image creatively. So that, for example, texts which are normally illustrative, explanatory, can become hyperlinked, or how do we use them in a static form or as a normal text? In fact, how do we integrate a text, for example, a statute book, with a webcast? And that goes for images as well. Which means that we really have to look at the design of webcast environments and how they fit in with those kind of older technologies, as it were. Patricia is now going to describe to us, first of all, how the design of those webcast environments actually work.
Thank you, Paul. A webcast lecture, of course, is this a bit loud? That's okay. A webcast lecture, of course, is just basically a talking head, a lecture on a screen. But of course, it's not restricted in the same way as a conventional lecture is, by time, place or audience. A webcast lecture can be watched at any time from the student's point of view during the day, at weekends. They can take it home with them, they can watch it within the university, and they can watch it together, they can watch it with their colleagues. A webcast lecture isn't constrained by time either. It doesn't have to be an hour long. It could be 20 minutes or 25 minutes. So there's all these advantages. It's not restricted in the same way as a conventional lecture is. But of course, a talking head on a screen can be quite tedious in terms of the student experience. It can be seen very much just as a cheap lecture. So what we've done is we've used the webcast, as Paul said earlier, we've taken it as a focus for a whole learning resource and put it into an organisational centre to benefit and to enhance the student's learning experience. But as Paul said as well, we had to be very careful that we integrated this properly. We had to integrate it with other technologies, for instance with intranets, discussion forums, web links, online resources. But we also had to integrate it with traditional forms of teaching and learning. And the particular courses that we were dealing with here, we've used a form of blended learning rather than going down the kind of distance learning route. And we retained aspects of traditional teaching and learning within our virtual learning environment rather than just omitting that altogether. So what I want to do is I want to show you the virtual learning environment we've created. But before I do that, I'd like to take you through some of the design steps and some of the stages that we've gone through in the process of development. Because I think when we do that, you'll see what has shaped our views and why we've done things in particular ways. And in particular, I want to look first of all at our early concept of a webcast environment. So we have our talking head here up on the left-hand side, with a number of, below that we would have some navigational tools in terms of the video, fast forward, etc. Some bookmarks here to allow you to navigate through the webcast fairly quickly with some subject headings. PowerPoint slides where we wanted a combination of on-screen text and images. And the resources, the web links and resources. Now, it was this which we had to be very, very careful in the planning stage because, of course, we wanted the resources to be obvious to the students, but we didn't want to be so obvious that it became intrusive. So we had to have a kind of fine balance there between hiding them and making sure that they were relevant when it was appropriate. We also saw some form of toolbar containing learning controls, guidance and instructions, things like, for instance, access to other VLEs, perhaps access to flowcharts or the mnemonics, which the students might like, a learning log, and various other generic tools to do with the course aims and objectives, assessment details, and perhaps some good and bad practice examples. So these are the kind of things we wanted to encompass within our virtual learning environment. In terms of the experience that we had when we set out to build our webcast learning environment, we have approximately 25 webcast projects over the last 3 years or so. Most of these have been one-off. They've been one-off for short courses rather than being throughout a whole lecture series. But they have now spanned. We've got 2 modules now which are entirely webcast lectures with no formal face-to-face teaching in terms of lecturing, which is what I'm going to be showing you later. We've used this mainly in blended learning, as I've said already, but we have got one module which is wholly distance learning. When we were setting up this webcast learning environment, we didn't have any formal models to follow. We really were starting with, to a certain extent, a clean slate here. We didn't go on formal training courses. We were just drawing on the experience which we had already from the webcasts that we'd carried out and our own experience of education. Now, I want to look at some early examples here of some webcast lectures because we already knew that the combination of video and on-screen text is a very powerful tool in terms of learning. But I think what we learned in our early webcasts here was the kind of subtleties, certain subtleties involved in presentation and in format and in camera angle. And these subtleties affected the student experience, affected their perception of what they were looking at. And I'm going to look at 2 in particular here from Richard Susskind and try and compare these and let you see just the differences in the presentation format, camera angle, which would affect them. And perhaps you would like to think of these ideas as we're looking at the webcasts here, just presenter behaviour, some of the navigational tools, some of the information that's been given out to maybe have your own ideas as you're watching this. Now, Richard Susskind is a visiting professor at Glasgow Graduate School of Law.
Hello everyone. My name is Richard Susskind. I'm visiting professor to the Centre for Law, Computers and Technology at Strathclyde University. I have quite a varied existence involving a bit of academic work but also advising bits of government and many major law firms. And one of the challenges I faced over the last few years, I've been working in the field for 20 years, but over the last few years I've been trying to find ways of explaining the complex interrelationships between various aspects of information technology and how it affects legal practice. And by various aspects I mean concepts such as IT, electronic commerce, knowledge management, client systems, all terms I'm going to explain over the next few minutes. What I've tried to do is develop a model or two to try and clarify the way in which all these quite complex ideas interrelate. And what I'm going to put to you is a model that I call the grid as a way of explaining these complex interrelationships. Now, you'll go through a rather strange experience, I suspect, as I talk. For the first few minutes, you'll wonder what on earth I'm saying, and the model won't be entirely clear. But I hope after about 6 or 7 minutes, you go, aha, I see what he's talking about. And thereafter, hopefully this model will, for all time, help you understand the way in which IT is going to radically alter the practice of law and the administration.
Okay, just a quick look at the screen there. We've obviously got our video, we've got our number of controls, and we've got some bookmarks on the left-hand side, which as we scroll through these, the PowerPoint slides come up, and the PowerPoint slides come up automatically as Richard is speaking there. But of course, if the students already watched it once or twice, maybe want to go to particular parts rather than watching the whole thing all over again. But let's just have a look at the image there of Richard Susskind. You can see that Richard is leaning forward. It's a nice rounded image we've got there. His laptop is not intruding onto where he is. There's no sharp edges there. We felt this was quite a good image of Richard, a good image to display to students, one which draws the students in. We have a feeling of intimacy there with the presenter. Just contrast this one.
Question.
Yeah.
You click on one of those.
It does, yes, exactly. It goes straight to that part.
The purpose of this module is to look at another model I've developed, quite different from the grid that many of you may have seen. This model is known as the client service chain. For those of you who want to read further about it, it's in Chapter 2 of my book, Transforming the Law. A little bit about the context might be helpful, the context of my development of this model. I wrote it really at the peak of the time of the dot-com bubble before it burst. And I have been reading all sorts of interesting articles and books about developments and tech.
Just again, looking at the image there. The image is much sharper corners there. I mean, obviously there's a change in his attire. Richard had a fairly casual fleece on the first one. He's now dressed up in a suit. There's a fairly sharp images there, and the intrusive laptop coming into the video there. And the picture's actually been cut off from the bottom with half a glass of water there. It's not an image which draws you in. And indeed, Richard's standing face onto the camera there rather than at an angle and looking round. So it's certainly one which doesn't necessarily draw the viewer in. And on a one-off, that's not such a big issue. There's only one lecture that's being watched. But in a whole series of lectures, we don't want to switch the students off. We want to draw them in and get that feeling of intimacy. Now, the last time we gave this presentation, Richard Susskind was actually in the audience. And he said that when he'd come up, first of all, to give the first talk, he was coming up on another matter to the university, and we just asked him, would he come in and do this talk? And he did. He just came in, sat down, and just presented very casually, very normally. He's a very fluent communicator. But on the second occasion when he came up, he was asked, would he come up particularly to do this talk? And this time he said he felt he actually had to be a little more formal, a little more serious, and actually have a little bit more gravitas about his performance. And it's interesting how actually almost trying to perform has actually to a certain extent detracted from the performance itself. So just another example of a webcast lecture, the last one here, again, which shows how this feeling of intimacy is lost. This is another one-off lecture on...
Good morning then. My name's Scott Slorich. I'm one of the visiting professors here. And work with Paul putting together this course. And some of you may have seen me on the earlier in the year during the diploma. I'm Professor of Curriculum Design down at Nottingham Law School, where I work on the legal practice course, which is the equivalent to the diploma down in England. So we're here to look at negotiation today. We're going to do three things really. We're going to review some
again to show how a lecture situation doesn't really translate terribly well.
I did some research with a group of lawyers, and, well, perhaps unsurprisingly, 75% of lawyers saw themselves as rather nice, accommodating, cooperative people when it came to negotiation. the same stuff.
You can see there that Scott was doing everything which in a face-to-face lecture is encouraged. He was stopping to let students write things down. He was pointing to the blackboard. In fact, he starts walking around the room. All things, as I say, within a face-to-face lecture are encouraged, but in terms of a webcast lecture, it's a complete turn-off for the students. The student feels peripheral to the experience. They're not being drawn in. So these are all the kinds of things which we had to take into account when we were developing our own webcast lecture series. And indeed, some of the problems we felt with our early webcasts was they were very much presenter-driven. We weren't looking at the user. We weren't looking at the student to a certain extent. We were looking at the presenter. There was really very little on-screen integration and very limited navigation. You could click onto the various bookmarks there, but it wasn't much navigation. And indeed, they were seen very much as one-off independent events, very isolated events for both staff and students. And we wanted to look at it as being part of a coherent whole. So what we have done is we have developed a webcast learning environment for the teaching of civil and criminal court procedure. And I'm going to show you this just now. What we have, criminal court practice ran in first semester last year and civil court practice ran in second semester. And we have modified the civil court practice virtual learning, webcast learning environment. We've modified that in light of what happened with the first semester course. So it's actually the civil court practice course that I'm going to show you first of all. Now what we did with the students was that we gave them all the lectures and a number of other resources which I'll show you on 2 CDs. And within the CD box, they have a little booklet here, which is a kind of like module handbook which they would be given. And the module handbook gave them information about how to learn with webcasts. It gave them a synopsis of each lecture. And it also gave them the tutorials which they were going to have, because we were not abandoning traditional teaching and learning altogether. They were going to have webcast lectures, which would mean they wouldn't have face-to-face lectures, but they were going to have tutorials on a weekly basis with a tutor on a 1:12 ratio. So what the students had in terms of the tutorial preparation was concerned was they were told each week what they had to do in terms of reading, but also what lectures they had to watch. So they were given that information. And at the beginning of the year, we gave them a training session on the webcast learning environment. It didn't last terribly long, and in retrospect, I think we would do more next year in terms of the feedback that we've got. We gave them a training session for probably about half an hour, 45 minutes or so on the environment. And then we gave them the CD. The CDs, they tended to use at home. It was also a web application, so they could use it in the university as well at any time. Our students don't tend to have broadband at home, so they couldn't watch the videos at home, but they could take the CD home and watch it there. We did it for this particular course because we had a number of issues with it, a number of practical considerations. For instance, we don't have lecture halls for 250 students. We don't have the wonderful links that you have here. The lectures were at 5 o'clock at night because they were given by an experienced criminal or civil court practitioner who was going to come in at that time. Students didn't like 5 o'clock lectures. And on top of that, the lectures quite often cancelled because they were stuck in court. So they tended to vote with their feet by the time it came to the end of the course. So it was a class which was ripe for some form of change. On top of that, the lectures themselves dealt with procedure. They dealt with the rules. They took the student from one end of the court action to the other, but it was a very flat process. They just went through all the specific rules, all the specific cases. Whereas the tutorials dealt with the practical applications of the rules. So they were coming into the tutorials to do motions and hearings and role play and applying the rules which they were learning in the lectures. But of course, sometimes the lectures kind of went out of sync with tutorials because they were being missed or lectures weren't turning up. And also the students tended to see them in a kind of parallel. They didn't tend to join them up. And what we wanted to do, what Paul mentioned earlier, was integrate. We wanted to make sure we were integrating the lectures and the tutorials and all the other resources as much as we possibly could. So when the students open up the CD, this is what they're faced with. They have the lectures. We also have 2 units on 2 multimedia units, one on advocacy and pleadings, one on drafting, and a small unit on assessment. So if we go into the webcast lectures first. If I press F11, The students here have an online handbook, and again they tended to use the online handbook in university, and they had the hard copy at home. They have some help in case they can't get through the webcast, and it was replicated in the handbook. They have software which they could download at home. We used Media Player 9, and most students didn't need to download any software. When they went into the webcast lectures themselves, there are 4 lectures, introduction 4 lectures on this CD, and lectures 5 to 10 on the second CD. So the ones that are highlighted here are the ones that are on this CD. And as they scroll up and down this, you can see that they are given the lecture headings, the lecture topics for each lecture. So if they wanted to find out a particular area, they could just scroll on down here and find out which lecture they wanted to look at. They're also given that for the CD that's not there. Of course, they can't click on there, but at least they know what's in the other one if they're looking for something. Let's go into one of these lectures. Lecture 2. Welcome to the second lecture in the Civil Procedure lecture series. In the first lecture, we looked at the initiating document in an ordinary action in the Sheriff Court. We looked at the establishing of jurisdiction in that action. I'm going to turn the sound down because, like Peter Martin said this morning, it's quite incongruous listening to yourself up there and down here as well. So we're not going to criticise my style as such at the moment. However, you can see here that we have a number of navigational tools up and down here for stopping and starting the webcast. You can also see that we also have a volume control here, and we have a number of section headings which, if you scroll over, each section heading is identified beneath it. And again, we can go directly to any of these section headings within the lecture, and I will shortly. I'm going to stop it at the moment. Lecture number 2 is identified there, and you can return to the lecture menu at any time. At the bottom of the screen here, you'll see a running time of 30 minutes. Now, again, this was something which was an improvement from the first iteration. The first iteration, we didn't tell them how long the lecture was. We just let them watch it. But the students really appreciated knowing that, because if they had only half an hour before a lecture, they knew they could watch the whole thing. Or if they were coming to the end and you had another 10 minutes to go, they would keep going sometimes rather than wondering, well, there's another half or another 40 minutes. So they really appreciated having that running time. Also along the bottom there, you'll see there is a timeline. And the students can click on there and scroll along, and again they're taken maybe to halfway through the lecture, the end of the lecture or whatever, so they can scroll through as well to various parts of the lecture as well as appropriate. Now I'm going to look at some aspects, some of the other functionality now of the webcast lectures here. One of the things I mentioned earlier was resources, and we do have a whole section for resources which I'll show you earlier, but of course there were certain resources we wanted the students to have access to quite quickly. Rather than having to go into another screen, we wanted them to have access on the screen just to click on. Now here you'll see I talk about OCR, Ordinary Cause Rules there, 8.1, and the Ordinary Cause Rules are basically the Bible in terms of civil court procedure. So I wanted the students to be able to access that very quickly, be able to look at that as I mentioned it, but I didn't necessarily want to have the whole rule on the screen in front of them because it can be quite lengthy. So we created a little pop-up here for them, View Ordinary Cause Rules. And for this particular lecture, we're only dealing with Ordinary Cause Rule 8 or 9. And again, this is to try not make it too obtrusive. I didn't want the whole Ordinary Cause Rules here, so they scroll through just the 2 they're using for this lecture. They get the whole set of rules elsewhere, which I'll show you. So you can see here they can access it very easily. They don't have to stop me talking at this point. If they want, they can keep me talking and listen to me at that time, or they can stop me. It's entirely up to the students' wish there. And of course, the more they watch, perhaps the more inclined they are just to pop it up very quickly while I'm talking. That away. Paul was talking earlier about, and myself, about integration of the resources. And this slide here, in this part of the lecture, I'm talking about a decree by default. It's a particular process that the students have to know about. And I'm explaining all the rules here about decree by default. But indeed, what I really want them to be able to do is actually see that decree by default being played out. And if you look at the bottom of the screen here, there's a small icon which tells the students you can view a motion for decree by default in the Advocacy Multimedia Unit. And it tells them how to access that. Now, this is a little bit where we haven't been able to integrate as well as we would like to, because what I'd really like the students to be able to do is click on that icon and be able to pop up the video role play at that point. We can now do that. At the time we set this up, we couldn't, but we can now do that. And the next iteration for next year will allow the student to be able to go straight into that role play there. Other aspects of the functionality here as well, we've used diagrams. Again, one thing in terms of procedure is very important to see the whole procedure. So we've been able to use diagrammatic illustrations there, which the students, again, have found quite useful. Now, of course, what we didn't want to do was have the students purely sitting passively watching lectures. So what we've tried to integrate...
Hello, and welcome to Lecture 4 in the Civil Procedure Lecture Series.
Get me off there. What we've tried to do is integrate a number of activities within the lectures. So this is just one of the activities here. Again, it's to try and let the students see the whole procedure and be able to work their way through it. Now, we call this the oil refinery in terms of all the bits and pieces that are going out here, either that or some form of electrical board. But this basically gives a pictorial demonstration of all the various steps that the person raising and defending the action will do in their interaction with the Sheriff Clerk. And we want the students to know what kind of order, what kind of documentation has to be transmitted between or among those three people. And yes. So this is the activity here which we ask the students to do. It's basically a click and drag here, in that the students have all the steps here, which are undertaken throughout the court action. They have to decide which comes first. And if they click on number 1 there and drag it down, it will change colour when they get to the correct answer. If they put it on the wrong answer, it doesn't change colour. So they have to make strategic choices there as to which is the correct answer. The students really appreciated having these kind of activities built into the system there. Because again, it was to a certain extent a kind of isolated process here. Really, this was allowing them to reflect on their learning. At this moment it does, because you see the little button there which says Restart Webcast. It stops for the activities, yes. Now, what I wanted to show you now is some of the resources that we used here, because that basically what you have at the moment is the PowerPoint slides and the lectures. But what really takes this into another dimension is the resources which we've made available to the students. And if the students click onto this little icon here, we have an external resources menu. And again, at any time within the lecture, the students can click this through and they can stop the lecture if they want, or they can keep the lecture going. But at any time, they can bring up these resources. We have a number of web links here for the students. This takes us to... This takes us to the Civil Court web page, and you can see there's a number of web links here that the students can access at any time. We also have a discussion forum here for the students as well, which is basically a procedural court here, which the students have a number of case studies which they can look at, which they can enter, and which they can discuss. We can have a look at that later again if you want to in more detail. They have the ordinary cause rules, which I mentioned earlier, and they have the complete set of rules here. So at any time they want to, they can access the complete set of rules. They also have a downloadable version of the lecture slides. We didn't give them this for the first iteration of the webcast environment. Didn't give them that. There was a certain loss of structure. They really appreciated having the webcast slides.
Yeah.
Hello, and welcome to lecture.
About that. We also give the students the statutes that they'll want to refer to throughout the course. These are mainly web links, but there's some PDF documents there. We give them the cases, which they would want to refer to. Again, these are under subject headings, and even within each subject headings, there are subheadings again, a whole range of cases there for the students to refer to. We can't deep link the cases into West Lawn Bailey, but we do give them access to West Lawn Bailey so that they can go straight to those and search for the cases if they wish. We also give them a documentation section here. Now, of course, the court procedure is very much form-based. So we give them immediate access here to the main forms which they will need within a court action, within their study here. These are the documents which are taken directly from the active sedierent. So this is a document which has not actually been fleshed out. This is the template, basically. But not only do we give them the templates, but we also give them the actual fleshed out document as it would be prepared for a court action. There's a kind of mini court action here we have called Anderson against McNair, and we have here the documents which, oh God, I've done it again, which they would want to look at. How do I get this? Coming up like this.
Well, Patricia's getting back. I think it's something to do with the projection there that it comes up full screen. It's interesting that what we're trying to do there is to integrate the intranet that you saw there. And by the way, we use. It's interesting somebody was presenting yesterday from Vanderbilt on using Microsoft SharePoint Team Services as their intranet. We use the same at the GGSL. And what we try to do is to integrate the Webcast environment that you're seeing here with the intranet, so that if students do have links from their home intranet links, then they can go on the web and access our intranet from inside the CD environment, as it were. And of course, there's no problem if they're accessing this environment online from within the GGSL, the Glasgow Graduate School of Law.
Okay, I'm going to move on quite quickly because I see we're running out of time here a little bit. This is a multimedia unit which we have created for the students in terms of for advocacy and pleading. And this is that motion for degree by default that I mentioned earlier. We take the students through the various stages, the introduction here which gives them the purpose of the unit, gives them the learning outcomes. At any time, if they want to see the learning outcomes, they can roll over that part of the screen there and the learning outcomes become apparent to them. They're taken through the various stages by being given a background and scenario here. And again, in terms of integration, the scenario is one which they will have used within their advocacy and pleading tutorial. So they're able to see this now actually as an actual role-played scenario here. And again, a short bit of video here to begin the submission.
Options hearing, Simpsons Prime Meat Limited against MacArthur's Restaurant and the partners thereof.
Good afternoon, my Lord. Doig on behalf of the pursuers.
Again, we have little prompts here for the students. Note who speaks first and the reaction of the sheriff, just so that they're not passively watching this. They're actually thinking about what they're watching. Now, we basically take the students through all the various stages of this particular decree. We look at each side's arguments to the court, and then finally the sheriff's response and the defendant's agent's response as well. I'm going to come out of that, and we have another unit on writ drafting, which again is part of the course, which basically takes the students through the various stages. We have a scenario here that they're given, and then they're taken through all the various stages of drafting a writ. In the second scenario, they are given the information and they're required to draft the writ themselves. So they're being shown how to do it, taken through that, and then they require to undertake the activity themselves. And we give them a template at the end so they can actually do it as often as they like. And finally, we have a very small unit on assessment. This basically is just repeating what they're given in their handbook here. There are two parts to the exam, Part A and Part B, and we give them the two different types of questions which the students will be facing in the exam. Click on and they'll get various questions there. We also have some interactive questions in Part B, which is objective questions where they can click for the answer, and they're given the answer there. Again, it's very useful for the students to have this assessment unit, because if they're not having the frequency of lectures, this has been a very useful tool for them just to be able to practice the exam techniques there. Okay. Well, we do, but you can...
Yeah, absolutely. Could I say that the splash screen at the end there kind of tells you who's doing a Learning Technologies Development Unit, LTDU, within the Glasgow Graduate School of Law. Basically, it's composed of a Learning Technologies Development Officer, Scott Walker, who is in charge of a programmer and two web designers and a network maintenance officer. And that unit, with whom we work very closely, basically produces what you see there. Also has created and maintains what you saw yesterday, the virtual, those of you who were at my presentation yesterday, the kind of virtual community on the web, Ardcalach. And you may have caught some kind of glimpses of Ardcalach coming through there, as it were, you know, in terms of the cases that were cited in Ardcalach's share of court. So we're trying to integrate the virtual reality, as it were, of Ardcalach into this webcast environment as well. But effectively, in answer to your question, Larry, those are the people who put this together. Sorry? And Flash, and of course Adobe, yeah, principally, yeah. We also do a lot of multimedia skills units as well, advocacy, training, interviewing and such like. And again, we use the same kind of formats and the same kind of approach. That tends to be much more kind of highly structured and cognitively structured as well, around a kind of tell, show, do review, a bit along the lines that Larry was talking about earlier in his session. And we find that works really well for exactly the reasons that Larry pointed out, in terms of that really steep whooshing learning curve, you know, before they begin to plateau out, certainly in our course. That's been our experience as well. But we found the multimedia to be extraordinarily useful and effective as a learning tool at the show stage of the tell, show, do, as it were.
Other questions now? Okay, we've got a few questions here. We actually have quite a lot to show you in terms of the feedback as well, which we'd like to show you. But maybe we could have a quick look at some questions. I just wonder if you have any reactions to what you've seen there, and whether you think this would be a useful resource perhaps in your own law school teaching.
Possibly have an institution like to support your activities.
Well,
Going to go out and raise money to do something.
LTDU, the programmer who put this together, the web designer who was involved principally in putting this together, worked solidly for about 4 weeks on the civil materials. Patricia and I worked together on the design of it. Principally Patricia, of course, because it's her course and she's appearing in it and actually kind of constructing the thing. Apart from that, there's obviously the kind of network maintenance issues involved in that as well. But you know, once you have the template for it, I mean, once we've done this, for example, then it's relatively easy to begin to kind of pour content, as it were, and activities into that structure. What Peter was saying about, you know, having done it once, it's a lot easier then to kind of keep going, producing those learning objects, as it were, that can be turned to advantage in so many different ways. Well, think of this environment, as it were, as a kind of learning object. And certainly we've used it not just for these courses, but for things like, for example, an induction course on our LLB course, where students are coming straight from school, and we give them these webcasts on things like legal writing, how to read cases and statutes, I do those webcasts, and it's slightly different from the format of this one in that they just have 2 minutes of me, and then I deliberately slide myself to one side, and from thereafter it's audio. And what we have there is a really sophisticated kind of workspace for students in which they can do little activities where they're asked to read a case, to summarise a judgment or something like that, and we give them feedback on that. So that kind of workspace there is very flexible that you saw there. It looks as if it's just a kind of dump for PowerPoint slides and what we've been seeing there, but I think you've seen already via the oil refinery little kind of activity and all the rest of it, it can be used for a lot more than that. Any other points? Yeah?
Yeah, but it wasn't 1 month as in one block. What we were doing was over a period of time, and this is the time which our web developers estimated it took him to do that 1 month. I have to say, I think that's a fairly conservative estimate of the time that he took on it. Personally, I think it is. And of course, our time similarly was over a period of time. It wasn't a case of saying you can say this is a 1 month block. We started the Webcast lecture project about this time last year. We started just after Easter last year doing the lectures and the kind of storyboarding and that kind of thing at this point. And we had to have the first one up and running by September, by the end of September. Now, we were working right up to the wire to get that done over the summer. Yeah. Yeah, and the second one, we literally started the second one immediately. We had the first one out. We started doing the second one, and that one was going out in semester 2 just after Christmas last year. And I mean, we basically didn't have a Christmas holiday. We just worked all through to get that ready.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it. I hadn't actually thought of that before. I don't know. I kind of think that we started out like Lewis and Clark, with general instructions in our heads and a general direction of where to go. And we encountered lots of interesting things on the way, and we kind of logged it and all the rest of it. But basically, what we were trying to do there was to create a resource environment, and not just have the streaming video. The streaming video would be extremely tedious after a while. Moreover, it's not a good use of the technology. We can actually produce a resource environment there which persuades the students that this is actually better than a face-to-face lecture in many, many ways. Not in all ways. Interactivity is not there. We may build in interactivity in asynchronous discussion forums and all the rest of it, and that's perfectly possible. But for us, we wanted to access lots and lots of resources and have them literally at students' fingertips. And if we have the opportunity, we'll go in to see what the students actually said about all of that in the feedback. Yeah, yeah. That's a really interesting point, and we'll come back to that in the feedback, yeah. And we'll certainly look at that, Peter. Then, one more point? No, so far we've just used this on our one course. This is the first year it's been used. Video conferencing, we don't have the facilities for video conferencing within our school. It's as simple as that. We'd have to use the general university facilities, and it's difficult. I think that if we were to go down some kind of communicational route, it probably wouldn't be video conferencing, even for straightforward distance learning rather than flexible learning, which is what this is. And it would be much more a kind of asynchronous route that we'd be going around, possibly chat. But video conferencing is still difficult for us given our facilities. Okay. Okay, this year, very quickly, this year what we did was put together a webcast learning project. And basically what we tried to do was examine in great detail what the aims actually say. Patricia.
Okay, so we were looking at the variation of student learning, just as Peter was saying, how did they learn, how did they take notes, and also the quality of the learning, what they got out of it at the end of the day. And we had a phenomenographical approach to the methodology, and we had a whole variety of ways that we gained data from the students. At GGSL, we're very careful in terms of evaluation feedback, and it's very important for us to draw as much information from the students, from the student experience. And as you can imagine here, this was a huge change for us. We were taking the students completely out of the lecture and giving them something totally different. So we had to be very careful in terms of our evaluation to ensure that we knew what the student experience had been like. So we we had a selection of 11 students whom we tracked throughout the year. And they filled in and submitted a log each week, either online or in hard copy. And they had to do this whenever they used the resources, whenever they watched the lectures or used the resources, they had to give us feedback on how they did it, what they did, what resources they used, and how easy they found it to use, how they found the navigation. And we also had some focus group discussion at the end of the first semester, and followed by some individual interviews early the following semester. And these we recorded. And we had other individual interviews at the end of the exam process as well. We recorded these too to see how things had fitted in terms of their exam revision as well. So again, it was a totally different process for them. The project group had a questionnaire to give us some statistical data, and we also had the end of the year evaluation data from the whole cohort, which we would do as a matter of course. So that was the methodology that we used in terms of the project itself. So what did we find out at the end of the day? Now, there's quite a few of these to get through, so I'm going to go through them quite quickly. The timeline, for instance, remember I was talking about the timeline earlier, and then this one here you can see is about halfway through. The timeline in the criminal court project was slightly different. It was a scroll-along timeline here, which was all sectioned out according to each PowerPoint slide, so the students could scroll along, and when they stopped, the lecture would pop up at that point. But you can see from this quote that the student actually preferred this one. I liked the way it changed on this one, so it was all on the same screen. But they did like the criminal one because it was labelled, but indeed also identified that they could actually, they didn't necessarily need the labels here because the labels were basically the same as the section headings they had at that point. So that was one of the changes we made from one iteration to the second this year. Finding resources, we just assumed the students would explore the environment. We assumed we wouldn't necessarily have to direct them to various parts. And I think this is something we'll probably have to look at in a bit more detail. There was a very useful flow chart we gave to the students, which gave all the procedure and all the different routes that the procedure could go on. And it was found in the documentation section of the resources. Now, you can't quite see it here, but it's fourth down there, Sheriff Court, Ordinary Court, flow chart of procedure there. And all the students didn't necessarily find this. It was a really, really useful tool if they'd found it. This is the comment here, a little dialogue here between the interviewer and the student. And you'll see here that they're asked, did they use the flow chart? Well, not sure where that is. Well, go into the, let's have a look at it. Oh yes, I printed that off. Did you find it useful? Yes. Okay, that's interesting. And then the student volunteers. I took that to tutorials actually, and quite a lot of people noted, and where did you get that, they said. So the students weren't finding some of these resources. And indeed, even some of our study group who felt they liked visual aids hadn't actually found this particular one. So that's something, again, we're going to have to look at more carefully in future. The discussion forum was another one which the students didn't necessarily find, although we directed them to it. We told the tutors, we gave the tutors information, said read this out to the students so they know what it is. We put notices up on the intranet. We did all sorts of things for them to draw their attention to it. But they didn't find it. Now, you see the first quote there. I didn't know it was there. I'm not the least IT literate person, but it was kind of squirreled away. And it was, to a certain extent, squirreled away. You had to go into web links. And even there, the web links were all down the right-hand side of the page there, where the discussion forum was over here, this little corner here. Of course, finding the resource is one thing, but actually getting them to enter the forum was another. Students felt inhibited, and I'm sure you've all had experience of that. This student says here, I didn't want to post some answers and have it wrong for a start, have it all be corrected, or put something up really quite stupid and think that I'm right and have everyone laugh at me. So students felt inhibited about going in. Not only could they not find it, we'll have to find ways of encouraging them to go in and use this, because it's one of the things I think was talked about this morning in Peter Martin's discussion, is engaging the students and keeping them engaged. And this is one way we wanted to do it. And I think, I'm sure there are ways we're going to do it next year which will be better. But it's unfortunate this year that that didn't work. The main comment students had in terms of the attractiveness of this facility was the flexibility. They really enjoy being able to take it home with them or being able to watch it in university. This first quote here, I find it a hassle coming in here to study, train times unreliable, all the rest of it. Here at home I can get up early, study all day, go to work, come back and study, so I use it at home. They really enjoy being able to use it at home. They really enjoyed the flexibility of a reusable resource. The second quote there, one of the students said that there were a few dissenting voices about the whole webcast thing. Oh, just have the lecture, then it would be over. But that's the whole point, it would be over. Whereas this was a reusable resource they could watch as often as they like, whenever they liked. Even students who were not particularly pro the webcast lecture recognised that it was a convenient source of knowledge. One of the things we were a little bit worried about was the kind of social element of a lecture. In a lecture, the students they all become a kind of cohort, a kind of group. They sit in the same place. They talk to people about the lecture, maybe before or after, even during. They might compare notes afterwards about what the person had said, or perhaps an obscure point, get it clarified. And we were worried that this kind of relief of this kind of isolation they may feel within a webcast lecture would be a problem for the students. And we were concerned to know how did they cope with this isolation. And you'll see the students did still talk about the courses. You've seen the quote here. Everybody would still talk. We would just talk about them. If you didn't understand anything, you just phone people up the night before and say, what's this bit all about? You get cross ideas. Some people have different things. So the students still did talk about the lectures, and indeed, we actually watched them in the labs looking at the lectures, and sometimes what two or three would do is they would each have a different set of headphones and click it into the same monitor, and all three of them were watching the lecture at the same time, so they found ways of getting around that lack of social contact. And of course, they still met in tutorials. Not only, of course, was there an absence of social contact with the students, but obviously they didn't have a lecturer there. And because of that, the image seemed to matter more. The image seemed to become more important to them. There were different lecturing styles that the students were dealing with here. There was one lecturing style where the lecturer basically read from autocue, and another lecturer where the lectures were in the normal way with a PowerPoint slide and just speaking naturally. And the students tended to prefer the latter. In the former, what they actually wanted was a transcript. We don't want someone just reading to us. We want a transcript of of what's being said to us here, because they prefer. You see the first quote here. You've got, because it's someone else sitting there talking to you. They wanted an element of a conversation in terms of the image. Intonation and emphasis also was very important, especially when it came to revising for exams. They remembered things because of the way that it was said or the emphasis that was put on it. And again, a point which was made this morning. Would it have made any difference to them if they hadn't actually seen the person? Would it have been if you just had the audio going over in the background there rather than actually having the video? Now, our experience, certainly with our students, was that they felt more comfortable having the video there. The student here hardly looked at the webcast image because she was writing her notes, but it just seems quite nice having a person there. Now, there may be other ways of dealing with it, but certainly our students and the way that we dealt with it, the students certainly felt more comfortable having the lecturer present in the corner of the screen. I'm going to hand over to Paul now for...
Okay, I have 5 minutes to rip through about 300 slides here, so I'm going to have to go very fast, folks. Could I just wave this paper in your direction and say that it's all there, you know, just in case I don't make it through to the end. But the one thing I do want to get across here, and that is the two approaches to learning that out of all this massive amount of data that we got from this project, and that is there seems to be a paper world student who prefers face-to-face lectures, doesn't like these fancy learning tools, wants books, not these drivelling e-resources, and actually sat down and took verbatim notes. You know, stopped it, wrote again, stopped it, so he had, you know, his pile of notes that he would have at the end of the lectures. And it's a he as well. Only listened to the webcast once. Whereas there is an eWorld student, she was much more comfortable with the webcast environment, online information, used a word processor, as Peter was saying there. Viewed and reviewed the webcast, in order to listen, and also use the fast button, because we can, by right-clicking on the image, you can make it go faster, so that Patricia talks a lot faster. And it's quite, apart from being really funny, which is why she didn't do it, it's also a brilliant way of revising, because you're, as it were, going through the material very fast, but at the same time somebody's still speaking, a bit like me just now, very, very fast through the material. But actually, when you looked at the data, these are actually pathologies of learning. It wasn't as if there was one or the other. Most students were somewhere in between in a spectrum. And it's quite remarkable, because it's very much like the data that comes out of, for example, rhetorical literature, looking at student compositional habits and so on. Particularly the work of people like Linda Flower, Marlena Scardamalia, and others. And the comparison that Mike Sharples, for example, makes between the compositional styles of, say, Beethoven and Mozart, totally different. You know, Beethoven constantly revising. Mozart, apparently, getting it down first time, although he didn't always, if he was copying Bach's canon writing or whatever, he would always kind of make mistakes. But, the clean draft. Not so. Basically, what we have, again, are pathologies of compositional styles. Most composers actually do something in between. Most students, similarly here, did something in between, depending on what they wanted to do with the technology. So what we had to do was really give them as much in the way of variation, as it were, within the technology that they could use when they were actually studying. And writing and typing notes, you can see these quotes here. I won't go into them as I was going to do, just completely run out of time here. The quotes, most of them are in the short paper. If they ain't, they're in the long paper. We'll give you the URL in a moment or two. You can see the sort of things that are happening here. First quote, person's happier doing it pen and paper. Then look at the uncertainty of the student in the second quote. What do I do here? How do I cope with this? This is not a lecture. This is something, but I don't need to take notes here, because I can see this and I can review it again and again. You can see the puzzlement in students when they're trying to grapple with this new technology. And somebody there at the end saying, well, basically, I just wanted to use Word, and that would have been fine. People used two computers as well in the lab, and that was quite interesting. They listened to it on one, they took notes on the other. It's quite fantastic to see them kind of laid back in the seats, swivelling, from one to the other. Maybe if they had access to three, they would have used that in some kind of, like Star Trek bank of computers there in front of them. It was good to see that use of technology. Writing and listening as well, very interesting to look at how they were actually doing that. Knowledge objects, really fascinating study by two phenomenographers called Entwistle and Martin, Ferenc Martin, and I reference it in the paper there. What they looked at was how students actually study intensively for examinations, and their theory was that they basically construct these knowledge objects in the way that they hadn't done previously throughout their course. And the knowledge objects, as it were created by the intensity of the experience of knowing they had an exam. So therefore they had to really get to know that knowledge. What is it that students do when they really get to know that knowledge? Well, there's quotations there in the paper. And basically what we were asking the students here is, did it help or hinder your exam study? And for most of them, it actually helped. We found as well that students were using the webcast as mnemonic, not just as an oral mnemonic, but also as a graphic mnemonic as well, so that they could actually figure out in their mind's eye, place on, using our mnemonic for place on page, where the information was. And look at what they were doing there. Just watch the webcast again. This person would, obviously a learning style there, a learning preference for verbal over visual, and this sort of environment was wonderful for her. Other people would fit it into their timetable, and it was much better than just kind of copying stuff down, which is what she usually did in terms of just memorizing stuff. Final slide. The quality of learning. That is a critical thing here. Did this webcast actually hinder students from learning, or did it enable them to learn? Was it better than face-to-face lectures? It's a very difficult and a very complex question, but so we wanted to focus much more on the quality of student learning. And most students, not all, Paper World student was definitely not of this opinion. He was okay about convenience, but he preferred face-to-face lectures. But most of them said yes, and this is an example of the sort of comment that we got from students.
Yes, they did. Yeah. They generally did better. Yes.
Okay, folks, just a couple of general comments here. Our email addresses are up there. That URL there, which I think is in the paper, but maybe you want to take it down if you want the longer version of the paper. This is the web page to the right there, with the longer version of the paper, which you can see there. We've just put a graphic up rather than kind of going into it here. And you'll find about 60 pages worth of information there on our intranet, but you don't need any passwords to get into it. And finally, we have got very few of these left, and it was all we could cram into our cases, actually, to come over here. But we've got about 15 of the civil CDs here and about 5 of the criminal there. For those of you who are seriously interested in kind of taking this forward, please help yourself or share them amongst yourselves, then... and I think that's about all that we have to say.
Yep.
Thank you very much for listening.
I'll turn this off.
No, we didn't, because we wanted them to...
Just leave it. Oh, exactly. They love having it. The one